In Rome, the screams always ended before dawn, but the silence after was louder than any applause. We tell ourselves that we did not know, that the stone walls were too thick, that the corridors beneath the Colosseum were too deep, that the roar of 50,000 voices drowned out everything else. We tell ourselves that we were merely citizens, powerless against the machinery of empire, innocent spectators in a game designed by emperors and senators and men whose names were carved into marble while ours were written in dust. We tell ourselves many things, but the truth that sits heavy in the chest and refuses to be swallowed, is simpler and more terrible. We always knew, and we did nothing. I was there, not in the arena itself, though I watched the games like everyone else, cheering when the crowd cheered, gasping when they gasped, raising my cup of wine when a gladiator fell and the sand turned red beneath him. I was a shopkeeper. I sold oil and grain near the Ludus Magnus, the great gladiator school that sat in the shadow of the Colosseum like a smaller, meaner twin. My shop was not grand, my name was not important, but my window faced the street where they marched the gladiators every morning, and my door was close enough to the underground passages that sometimes, when the wind blew a certain way, I could hear things. Things I told myself I was imagining. Things I pretended were the echoes of animals in cages, or the grinding of machinery, or the distant thunder of chariots on stone. But they were not animals, they were not machines, they were women, and the sounds were not echoes, they were screams. Rome was not subtle about its cruelty. We crucified criminals along the roadsides so that travelers could see what happened to those who defied the Republic, who stole, who murdered, who dared to rebel. We fed Christians to lions in the arena and called it justice. We enslaved entire nations and marched them through our streets in chains, their children sobbing, their elders collapsing from exhaustion. And we lined the roads to watch and cheer because this was victory, this was civilization, this was what it meant to be Roman. We did not hide our violence, we celebrated it, we built monuments to it. But this was different. This was not done in the open. This was not proclaimed by heralds or immortalized in verse. This happened in the spaces between, in the tunnels beneath the arena where the torchlight barely reached, in the hours after the crowds went home and the city fell into the kind of silence that presses against your ears like water. The Colosseum was a marvel. We were proud of it. 4 stories of arches and columns, travertine stone hauled from quarries miles away, a feat of engineering that could be flooded for naval battles or drained for gladiator combat, seating arranged by class so that even in entertainment, everyone knew their place. Senators sat close to the sand, equestrians above them, plebeians higher still, women and slaves in the top rows. So far away they could barely see the blood. It was order, it was structure, it was Rome. Beneath that structure lay the hypogeum, a labyrinth of corridors and cells and chambers where the machinery of spectacle was hidden. Trap doors that opened to release lions, platforms that lifted gladiators into the arena as if they were rising from Hades itself, cages for animals, cells for prisoners, storage rooms for weapons, for armor, for the costumes that turned executions into theater, and rooms for the women. They were not called women in the records. They were called preda, spoils, property. They were the daughters and wives and sisters of men who had fought Rome and lost, Carthaginians, Gauls, Thracians, Britons, Jews, Germanics. Every conquest brought more. Every victory parade included them, walking in chains behind the chariots, their heads shaved or their clothes torn, symbols of Rome's dominance, proof that we were the greatest civilization the world had ever seen. After the parades, after the Senate had voted honors and the emperor had basked in applause and the soldiers had received their bonuses, the women were distributed. Some went to wealthy households as servants, some were sold in the markets, and some, The ones who were young or beautiful or simply unlucky were sent to the arenas, not to fight, not to die in the sand for our entertainment. No, their purpose was quieter, more private, more deliberate. They were kept beneath the Colosseum and the gladiator schools, in cells that smelled of mold and urine and something older, something that had soaked into the stone over years and decades and could not be scrubbed away no matter how much water the slaves poured. The cells had no windows, no beds, just stone floors and iron bars and darkness that became so familiar it stopped feeling like darkness and started feeling like the only reality that existed. The gladiators were brought to them, not all gladiators, not the ones who were too injured, too sick, too close to death, but the ones who won, the ones who survived, the ones who stood in the center of the arena with blood on their swords and heard their names chanted by 50,000 voices. Those men were rewarded with extra food, with better quarters, with wine, and with access to the cells. We knew this. Everyone knew this. It was not a secret, it was simply not discussed. Not in polite company, not in the forums, not in the letters that patricians wrote to each other about philosophy and law and the noble character of the Republic. It existed in the space of things that everyone understood, but no one acknowledged. Like the mass graves outside the city, where slaves were thrown without ceremony. Like the brothels near the docks, where girls no older than 12 stood in doorways. Like the crucifixions that lined the Via Appia after Spartacus fell, 6,000 men dying slowly, their bodies left to rot as warnings. We walked past these things, we saw them, and we told ourselves that this was simply how the world worked. I remember the first time I understood what was happening. It was late summer. The games had run for 5 consecutive days in honor of some senator's birthday, some man whose name I have since forgotten, but whose wealth had paid for a spectacle that left the arena soaked in blood and the crowd drunk on violence. On the final night, after the last gladiator had been dragged out and the sand had been raked and the citizens had stumbled home singing and laughing, I was closing my shop when I saw them. 3 gladiators. I recognized one. He was a Thracian named Spartacus, though not the famous one, just another man who had taken the name hoping it would bring him luck. He had fought that afternoon. I had watched him kill a Retiarius, a net fighter, in a match that the crowd had loved because it had lasted long enough to feel dramatic, but not so long that they grew bored. He had raised his sword when it was over, and the emperor had raised his thumb, and the crowd had roared, and Spartacus had become, for that moment, something more than a slave. He had become a hero. Now he walked through the street with 2 others, all of them still wearing the blood of the arena, still carrying the smell of sweat and sand and death. A guard led them. Not roughly, almost casually, as if this were routine, as if this were normal. They turned down an alley that led to one of the entrances to the hypodium, a narrow passage that most people did not notice because it was designed not to be noticed, and they disappeared into the shadows. I stood there, watching, my hand on the door of my shop, my mind understanding what I was seeing but refusing to name it. And then I heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable, a woman's voice, not a scream. Screams came later. This was pleading, words I could not make out but whose meaning I understood. Begging, the kind of sound that carries more weight than any scream because it still believes that mercy is possible. I closed my door. I locked it. I went upstairs to where my wife was preparing our evening meal, and when she asked me if something was wrong, I told her no. I told her I was only tired, and we ate in silence. And I did not sleep that night, and in the morning I opened my shop again and sold oil and grain to customers who smiled and talked about the games and how magnificent Rome was and how lucky we were to live in such a time. The woman's name was Emilia. I learned that later, not from any official record. There were no records of women like her. but from a slave who worked in the hypogeum, a man who cleaned the cells and carried water, and sometimes, when the guards were not watching, whispered to the women in their own languages, telling them that he was sorry, that he wished he could help, that he too had once been free. He told me her name one evening when he came to buy oil. He did not say why, he told me. Perhaps he simply needed to tell someone. Perhaps he thought that if he spoke her name aloud, she would not disappear completely into the silence that swallowed so many others. Emilia had been taken from Gaul. She was 17. Her village had resisted a Roman tax collector, and the legion had come and burned everything. Her father had been crucified. Her brothers had been sold to the mines. Her mother had thrown herself into the fire rather than be captured. Emilia had run. She had almost made it to the forest. Almost. A cavalryman had caught her by the hair and dragged her back, and she had been chained with the other survivors and marched south, across rivers and mountains and roads that stretched longer than anything she had imagined the world could contain. She had been in the cells for 8 months when Spartacus was brought to her. He did not want to go. That is important to understand. He was not a monster. He was not cruel. He was simply a man who had been broken and rebuilt into something that Rome could use. He had been a farmer once, in Thrace. He had planted barley and raised goats and married a girl whose name he no longer spoke aloud, because speaking it made the loss unbearable. Then the legion had come, demanding grain that his village did not have, and when the elders had protested, the soldiers had killed them and taken every man of fighting age as slaves. Spartacus had been sold to a lanista, a gladiator trainer, and for 2 years he had been beaten and starved and trained until he forgot what it felt like to be anything other than a weapon. When he won his first fight, they gave him extra bread. When he won his third, they gave him wine. When he won his 7th, they told him he had earned a reward, and they led him down into the darkness, and they opened a cell. And they told him she was his for the night. He stood in the doorway. Emilia sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes hollow. She did not look at him. She had learned by then that looking made it worse, that eye contact created the illusion of humanity, and humanity was dangerous because it made you hope that the person standing over you might choose differently, might walk away, might prove that not everyone in Rome was broken, but no one ever walked away. Spartacus hesitated. The guard waited behind him, torch in hand, watching. If Spartacus refused, there would be consequences. Not death. Death was too valuable. Gladiators who could win were investments, but there were other punishments. Starvation, beatings, being sent into the arena without proper armor, being paired against opponents you could not possibly defeat. Refusal was not an option. Refusal was suicide. So he stepped inside, the door closed behind him, and Emilia finally looked up. What happened in that cell, I cannot tell you with certainty. I was not there. No one who could speak freely was there. But the slave who brought water the next morning told me that Spartacus had sat on the floor across from her, as far away as the small space allowed, and that he had not touched her, that he had spoken to her instead. In broken Gaulish that he remembered from a campaign he had fought in before his enslavement, that he had told her he was sorry, that he wished he could free her, that he wished he could free himself, that they were both prisoners, both slaves, both powerless against the machine that had devoured them. Emilia had not responded. She had only stared at him with those hollow eyes. And when morning came and the guard opened the door, Spartacus had left and Emilia had remained, and nothing had changed except that now she knew that even the ones who were kind, even the ones who apologized, still came when they were told to come. Spartacus fought 3 more times. He won twice, lost once. The loss was not fatal, but it was ugly. A sword had opened his side and the wound festered, and he spent 2 weeks in the infirmary, burning with fever, delirious, calling out names that no one recognized. When he recovered, he was weaker, slower. The Lanista sent him into the arena again anyway, paired against a Nubian fighter who was younger and faster and hungry for a reputation. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. The Nubian spear went through Spartacus's throat, and he drowned in his own blood, while the crowd cheered, and his body was dragged out through the gate of death and thrown into a cart with 3 others. And by nightfall he was in a mass grave, covered in lime, forgotten. Amelia remained in her cell. Other gladiators came. Some were violent, some were indifferent. Some tried to pretend she was not a person, that she was simply a thing, a tool, something that had no thoughts or feelings or past. Some were like Spartacus. They hesitated. They apologized. They came anyway. She stopped speaking. That was one of the first things to go. Language required the belief that words mattered, that communication could change something, but nothing changed. So she stopped. She moved when she was told to move. She ate when food was given. She endured when men came. And the rest of the time she disappeared into herself, into a place so deep that no one could reach her, not even the slaves who cleaned her cell and whispered apologies in languages she no longer remembered how to understand. We, the people of Rome, did not see Amelia. We did not see any of the women in those cells. We saw the gladiators. We saw the lions. We saw the executions and the mock naval battles and the elaborate stage sets that transformed the arena into forests or deserts or distant battlefields. We saw the spectacle, and we cheered, but we also saw the things we pretended not to see. We saw the guards leading gladiators into the alleys that led to the hypogeum. We saw the slaves carrying water and bread into passages that had no other purpose. We saw the faces of the women on the rare occasions they were moved from one cell to another, their eyes empty, their bodies thin, their wrists scarred from chains. We saw, and we said nothing, not because we were monsters. We were not monsters. We were ordinary people. Shopkeepers and bakers and farmers and craftsmen. We had families. We loved our children. We honored the gods. We believed in duty and honor and the greatness of Rome. We told ourselves that the women in the cells were different from us, that they were enemies, that they had been captured in war, and this was simply what happened in war. That Rome was not cruel, merely practical. That the world was divided into those who conquered and those who were conquered, and we were fortunate to be on the winning side. We told ourselves that we had no power, that if we spoke, we would be punished, that the guards would come for us, that we would lose our businesses, our homes, our lives, and there was truth in that. Rome did not tolerate dissent. Senators who questioned imperial policy disappeared. Soldiers who refused orders were decimated, 1 in 10 executed as an example. Citizens who criticized the games were accused of disloyalty, of ingratitude, of forgetting the sacrifices that had made Rome great. But the deeper truth, the one we did not speak even to ourselves, was that we did not want to give up the spectacle. We did not want to lose the games. We did not want to acknowledge that our entertainment, our glory, our civilization was built on the broken bodies of people we had decided did not matter, because acknowledging that would mean acknowledging our complicity, and complicity required guilt, and guilt required change. And change was impossible, because change meant dismantling the very structure that made us Roman. So we watched. We cheered, we ate our bread and drank our wine and told our children about the brave gladiators and the greatness of the empire. And when we heard the screams at night, when we saw the empty eyes of the women in the cells, when we caught glimpses of the machine grinding people into dust beneath the marble and the gold, we looked away. We told ourselves it was not our fault, that we were not the ones wielding the swords or holding the keys or making the laws. We were just citizens, just spectators, just people trying to survive. But we were not just spectators. We were the audience that made the spectacle possible. We were the voices that cheered And the cheering justified the violence. We were the ones who paid for the bread and circuses with our taxes, our labor, our silence. We were the foundation upon which the arena stood. And without us, without our willing participation, without our collective agreement to look away from what we knew was happening, the machine would have stopped. There was a night, late in the season, when something happened that no one could ignore. A fire started in the hypogem. No one knows how. Some said it was an accident, a torch knocked over by a careless slave. Others said it was deliberate, an act of sabotage by one of the gladiators or prisoners who had decided that death by fire was preferable to whatever awaited them in the arena. The fire spread quickly through the wooden beams and dry straw, and smoke filled the corridors, and the animals in the cages roared and screamed, and the guards ran to put it out, shouting orders, dragging buckets of water, trying to save the machinery of spectacle before it burned. In the chaos, some of the cells were left unlocked, some of the women ran. Most were caught within minutes, dragged back, punished publicly the next day as a warning. But a few made it out. A few disappeared into the smoke and the darkness and the winding streets of Rome, and no one ever found them, or if they did not report it. Because by then, the fire had damaged part of the Colosseum, and there were more important things to worry about, like repairs, like schedules, like whether the games could continue. Emilia was one of the ones who ran. The slave who told me her name said he saw her that night, stumbling out of the smoke, coughing, her hands still scarred from chains, her eyes finally showing something other than emptiness. Fear, hope, the desperate, fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. He said he pointed her toward the Subura, the slums where escaped slaves and criminals and forgotten people disappeared into the crowds, where Rome's laws mattered less and survival mattered more. He said she ran. He did not know if she made it. I choose to believe she did. I choose to believe that somewhere in the tangled streets of Rome, or beyond the city walls, or in some distant village that never made it into the history books, Emilia lived. That she found some small measure of peace, some fragment of the life that had been stolen from her, that she survived. But I do not know, and the not knowing is its own kind of torment. The games continued, the Colosseum was repaired, new gladiators replaced the old ones, new women filled the cells. The machine kept grinding, and we, the people of Rome, kept watching, kept cheering, kept pretending that what happened beneath the arena was not our responsibility. Years passed. Emperors rose and fell. Rome expanded and contracted. The Colosseum stood, a monument to our greatness, a symbol of everything we told ourselves we were. But the screams did not stop. They echoed in the stone, in the tunnels, in the memories of those of us who had heard them and chosen silence. I am old now, my shop is gone, my wife is dead, my children have children, and they know nothing of this. They were not there, they did not see, and I have never told them, because what would I say? That their grandfather, their respectable, ordinary grandfather, lived in the shadow of the Colosseum and heard women scream and did nothing. That I chose my safety over their suffering, that I was complicit in a system that devoured the innocent and called it civilization. I tell myself that I had no choice, that I was powerless, that one man could not have stopped Rome, and all of that is true. But it is also true that I chose not to try, that I chose comfort over courage, that I chose to be a spectator rather than a witness. Rome fell. Not in my lifetime, but it fell. The empire that seemed eternal crumbled. The Colosseum, once filled with roaring crowds, stood empty. Vines grew through the cracks. The cells beneath were abandoned. The machinery rusted. The spectacle ended. But the silence remained. The silence of all of us who saw and did nothing. The silence that allowed the machine to keep grinding, the silence that made us complicit. I do not tell you this story to ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve forgiveness. I tell you this story because someone must, because the women in those cells had no voices, no records, no monuments, because history remembers the gladiators and the emperors and the battles, but it forgets the ones who suffered in the dark. Because if we do not speak their names, if we do not acknowledge what was done to them, then we are still choosing silence. And silence, I have learned, is the cruelest choice of all. If you are still here, then you have heard what Rome tried to silence. Stay with us. Subscribe before this story is buried again.